It's very unusual to stand before you at the beginning because I'm a W. I never go first. So, but I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be the first speaker, and I want to thank the organizers for the kind invitation. A Tale of Two Futures, Saskatchewan in 1905 and 2005. On September 4th, 1905, the city of Regina hosted an inauguration parade in honor of Saskatchewan's entry into Confederation as a province. One of the highlights of the ceremonies that day was the Mounted Indians, proudly decorated in traditional dress, riding at the head of the parade. But their placement that morning had nothing to do with honor or status. Instead, they symbolized a pre-modern past that the new province wanted to put behind it, if not forget. Quite simply, there was no place for Indigenous peoples in the new province of Saskatchewan. Indeed, if the province was going to fulfill its great destiny, then Indigenous peoples like those in the inauguration parade were expected to ride off into oblivion and never be heard from again. This very different attitude towards Indigenous peoples was only one of the many differences between Saskatchewan in 1905 and Saskatchewan today. In fact, the province was a much different place a century ago. In 1901, Frederick Haltain, the Northwest Territories Premier, first and only Premier, wanted one large province called Buffalo to be established between Manitoba and British Columbia. Haltain never got his wish in 1905, but the new province of Saskatchewan was no less confident about its destiny. Indeed, if the galloping population growth and wheat production in the early 20th century were any indication, then Saskatchewan seemed well on its way to greatness. The future would just have to catch up. And what was this future? Saskatchewan's business plan was to become Canada's most powerful and populous province. And the way to get there was the wheat economy. The Saskatchewan government consequently embarked on an ambitious province-building program determined to put the pre-1905 territorial past behind it while cultivating a new and separate identity as Canada's wheat province. The political leaders of the day not only believed that agriculture would guarantee the future of the province, but more importantly, that the province could decide and shape that future. Anything was possible in 1905. One dominant economic activity, the production of wheat for the export market, and one dominant zone of activity, the southern half of the province. By such means, Saskatchewan was confident that it would fulfill its great destiny. Perhaps the best place to explain this plan is to start with numbers. When Canada acquired the Northwest Territories in 1870, it was expected that the southern plains would become the home to hundreds of thousands of settlers. But immigration to the region lagged in the 19th century, and it was only until the late 1890s and the closure of the American settlement frontier that the great hopes for the West were finally being realized. So many immigrants were pouring into Western Canada in the early 20th century that Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier ordered a special census of the three Prairie provinces in 1906 to serve as a kind of statistical snapshot of the phenomenal growth. The statistics told a remarkable tale of unprecedented growth. In Saskatchewan, the 1901 population jumped 182% in 5 years, making the province larger than neighboring Manitoba or Alberta. Indeed, more homesteads would be taken out in the first decade of the 20th century than in the entire 19th century. 3 out of every 5 of these new homesteads were in Saskatchewan. What drove this settlement boom was the wheat economy. In developing a business plan for Saskatchewan, the government's gaze rarely extended to the northern half of the province. In fact, the geographic center of Saskatchewan is about 100 kilometers north of Prince Albert, where the majority population is largely Indigenous. One provincial cabinet minister even called northern Saskatchewan, quote, another country altogether. Saskatchewan chose instead to concentrate its energies on growing wheat for the Canadian export market. It believed that this activity, and this activity alone, was the best suited for the province with its vast amount of rich farmland. and its settlers occupied the land and turned pioneer homesteads into commercial operations, while a network of railway branch lines and grain elevators spread over the southern Saskatchewan landscape in the first decade of the 20th century, the wheat economy took root and flourished. By 1914 and the start of the Great War, Saskatchewan was producing half the wheat grown in Canada. The size of the crop at 225 million acres would have been 225 million bushels, would have been higher if producers had not seeded almost a million acres to oats to feed their workhorses. In fact, in 1926, when Saskatchewan was booming as a province, there were more workhorses than people in the province. Farmers grew wheat for the simple reason that Saskatchewan's settlement and development had been organized around its production. The homesteads, the railway branch lines, the country elevators, even the harvest excursions were all part of a grand design to supply wheat to the international export market, supported by the federal government and by investment in the region by large, powerful corporations. The large rural population, together with the steadily growing importance of agriculture, made farmers a dominant force in political life. Provincial politics, meanwhile, reflected agricultural interests and needs. The dependence on a single crop also influenced urban growth in the southern half of the province. The tens of thousands of prospective farmers who poured into the West after 1900 required the services of villages, towns, and cities if they were going to transform their homesteads into viable commercial operations. It was this new rural demand, precipitated by the record number of settlers, that fueled a town-building frenzy, the likes of which have never been seen again over the past century. The fastest-growing cities in Canada at the time were found in Saskatchewan. Saskatoon was a sleepy hamlet of 113 in 1901. 10 years later, it boasted 12,000 people. But even then, the city leaders disputed this number and did their own head counting, including people staying in hotels, people passing through on trains, and of course, pregnant women as too. What is often misunderstood, however, about this urban growth was that it was entirely dependent on the wheat economy, and that Saskatchewan was first and foremost a rural province where 3 out of every 4 residents lived in the country. Agriculture, then, was the defining feature of the province a century ago. The wheat economy would pave the way to Saskatchewan's future as Canada's powerhouse province, especially if the steadily growing production of wheat was any indication. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King represented the riding of Prince Albert for almost 2 decades, while Ottawa recruited 2 former premiers, Charles Dunning and Jimmy Gardiner, to be ministers of finance and agriculture, respectively. It's not too exaggerated to suggest that Saskatchewan not only expected to dominate the region, but lead the nation. This is where I take my break, have a sip of water, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, that is a pipe-smoking dog. Saskatchewan's chosen path would create problems during the Great Depression and the following decades. In fact, the emphasis on the wheat economy would compound the difficulties that the province faced in the post-Second World War period. In this new century, Saskatchewan faces a much different future. This future, though, will be profoundly different from the comfortable image of the province today. The late CBC journalist Peter Zowski, who got his start in Moose Jaw, liked to call Saskatchewan the most Canadian of provinces. Indeed, in the national consciousness, Saskatchewan is a boring place, like a pair of old comfortable slippers, a land of wheat fields, grid roads, and country elevators, where nothing important ever happens and anybody with talent or ambition leaves to make their mark elsewhere. We're frozen in time. How else do you explain that we're the only province that never changes its clocks? The shape of Saskatchewan is also unusual, if not unique. We are the only Canadian province with completely artificial boundaries, an upright triangle. In fact, it's often said that our unofficial motto should be Saskatchewan, easy to draw, hard to spell. And we're the only province whose capital, Regina, is not on a major body of water. And while we're at it, let's not forget that popular misconception that Saskatchewan is flat, completely bereft of any defining landscape. So there are the stereotypes. The reality is an increasingly urbanized society. 2/3 of the population lives in urban areas. We're an urban province, if you go by population. We're trying to come to terms with its agricultural past and its indigenous population. Indeed, at the start of this new century, the province is grappling with the twin challenges of meeting the needs of both a growing, young, urban, indigenous population and a declining, aging, non-indigenous population. At one time, Saskatchewan was the third most populous province after Ontario and Quebec, but those days are long past. Saskatchewan's population today hovers about 1 million, just above 1 million. Regina and Saskatoon will continue to grow. 2 out of every 3 urban residents live in those 2 cities, but at the expense of rural areas. Distance, in the meantime, has once again become a factor in rural lives, as the low population density and low demand mean that many services are now available only in larger cities. The decline of rural Saskatchewan is a reflection of the changed provincial economy. Rural population, the dramatic growth in the size of farms, and farm mechanization have changed the face of the province and the economy. Indeed, the growing importance of the resource sector has significantly reduced the contribution of agriculture to the provincial economy. During the 1950s, as much as 50% of income in Saskatchewan was farm income. So $1 and 2. By the 1990s, though, it had declined to 2%, so $1 and 50. For the first decade of the 20th century, it was 1%, so $1 and 100. And this decline has taken place even though producers have switched from wheat to other crops, in particular canola. Other resource sectors, providing much more revenue for the provincial economy, have picked up the slack. Since the Great Depression and the Second World War, successive provincial governments have made a concerted effort to reduce the dependence on agriculture in favor of other resources that command higher prices on the world market. And today, Saskatchewan's range of trade resources is quite diverse, from potash, the most extensive deposits in the world, to oil. You've heard of the Bakken field and the field around Lloydminster. To uranium. In the 1960s, we were called the Saudi Arabia of uranium. Some of our uranium is so rich it cannot be mined. To forestry products. Saskatchewan is half forested. And trade is carried on with several other countries. But the province has no control over international price and demand. And the province is dealing with those challenges today. Saskatchewan has become essentially a resource-based economy. And as the current provincial government has learned to its grief, if you cut resource revenue by 10%, you cut the economy by slightly less than 10%. Much of this new resource development is taking place in northern Saskatchewan and bringing to end decades of marginalization during which time the region was generally ignored by Regina. The integration of the provincial north into the Saskatchewan economy has meant better employment opportunities for northerners. In fact, new jobs are being created throughout Saskatchewan to replace those being lost in agriculture. The other challenge that Saskatchewan faces today is the role and place of its growing Indigenous population. As of 2001, Indigenous people, First Nations and Métis, made up almost 1 in 8 Saskatchewan residents. By 2045, they are projected to account for 1 in 3. So unlike the business plan, the original business plan, First Nations people did not simply disappear if you think back to that inauguration parade. It could even be argued that Saskatchewan First Nations are an integral part of Saskatchewan's future, are Saskatchewan's future. But there is cause for concern, for example, in their low graduation rate from high school, even though the overall provincial graduation rate has improved. That, for Indigenous peoples, has not. To their overrepresentation in the correction system, to their underemployment of the provincial economy. Nearly 1/4 of Saskatchewan's First Nations people are unemployed. while those who work off reserve earn $15,000 less than the general population. One economist has estimated that this education and employment gap is costing the provincial economy more than $1 billion per year. Responding to changes underway in the province, especially living with a resource-based economy largely dependent on international markets, will be challenging. But Saskatchewan has never been a province to think small, never one for believing that things were out of reach and settling for second best. The road to the future for Saskatchewan will be bumpy. Solutions will be found. It's just that there will be no easy answers. Remember, Saskatchewan is next year country and will win the Grey Cup again. Thank you.